Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our panel, Green Energy and Red Tape. We're so glad you could join us this morning. And if you're here today, that means you already know there's no time to waste to execute in New York City on bold and effective climate action. New York City's been rolling out climate and renewable energy policies since back in the Bloomberg administration in 2007. And the 2021 election season offers us an invaluable opportunity to see if city government has been helping or hindering the implementation of urban climate justice, and very particularly for our discussion today, urban solar power goals. Are we getting there? Are there more, I guess, boots on the ground is not quite the right word, but sunbeams on our roofs? Today's panel draws on the experience of seasoned solar energy and environmental justice movers and doers. These are folks who've been at it for quite a while, and they'll be delving into the successes they've had, the obstacles they've faced, and they'll be identifying opportunities the next city administration should, indeed must, undertake to best execute on the promise and the power of what we already have on the books, thus how to cut red tape. Each of our panelists, starting with Rob, then Sonal, then Amy, will be giving 5 to 7 minute presentations on their work and on what they've learned from their, I guess we put it all together, decades of experience. We will then have a brief group Q&A and chat, and then we will open the panel up to Q&A from our, well, Q from our audience and A from our panelists, and we really look forward to having that conversation with you. So with that, let us now at 10:08 a.m. Kick it off with comments and insights from Rob Crauderueff. Rob, take it away. Our first effort to let the sunshine in.
Thank you, Nancy. Yeah, it's exciting to be here today talking about the forthcoming administration and city council here in New York. We are at this very interesting moment in time. When I started practicing 2005, Bronx, then we completed the first demonstration green and cool roof in the Bronx at the time. And we've really been going from concepts and pilots now to scale. And the infrastructural scale, the neighborhood community scale, and the citywide scale. So the questions are a little different, and also the political scene is very different. For the first time, climate is front and center with economic issues and quality of life issues. It's seen as part and parcel of those rather than an aside or a secondary issue. So both for these elections as well as for the following 4 years, there's a very different mandate in place. And we should have the expectation of substantial political will to advance renewable energy, solar, and certainly beyond. And both we've seen historically, from the mayoral side, Bloomberg really took the lead, and we've seen a strong city council as well, in addition to the mayoral administration in the last 4 years, to push through a lot of policy. So we need to look at both the city council and the mayor for opportunities to advance and codify not just existing policies, but new and improved policies. So I'll talk for a couple minutes about why solar matters. Solar, really, I think of solar and battery storage as a pair. Though storage is really what we see at scale right now in New York. The first issue is from a utility perspective, that here in New York, we are constrained. We have limited transmission that can reach the city. 80% of our power generation must be created within city limits. So we're looking within the 5 boroughs, within our highly densely populated city, of where power can be generated. And of course, there's Sonal will talk about a lot of the equity issues, but there's an obvious siting challenge of any polluting industry or opportunity to advance equity through other types of, through renewable energy initiatives. And resiliency as well is something that battery storage is relatively nascent in New York City, not in the country, not in New York, but in New York City. Then there have only been so many projects developed so far. There are a lot of barriers, but we have to look at solar and storage. We know that the climate impacts are here today. So that's a third pillar that needs to be looked at of why solar and solar and storage matter. A couple lessons learned over, I want to focus on the last couple years here in the city of how to scale solar and how to scale solar in a way that can access affordable housing in low-income communities, at least from my perspective. One is that cash purchases are challenging. It is great when property owners, and there are models that can be pointed to. I know WEACT has had some success in some ownership, advancing ownership, but it's very challenging. A lot of barriers. It's a tax equity issue. Owners cannot use the tax credits very efficiently, can't take the depreciation benefits. Third parties can. There's an opportunity cost of development for affordable housing providers, that the time and effort to finance a project and build a project is very high. Community solar is a way to overcome these barriers. It is built at no cost to property owner. There's a lease payment that goes to the property owner that's discount on their bills. And those bill credit discounts also are extended to their tenants, at least the way that we're doing it, where we are developing. Right now, we have nearly 50 projects in development across New York City on affordable housing that focuses 100% on benefiting the affordable housing providers as well as their tenants. The model that we built out is really based on what we've learned is the barriers. We worked with Enterprise for several years, providing technical assistance to dozens of property owners across New York State and the affordable housing world, and offering a whole range of really wanting to focus on ownership at first. And the barriers were so great that we've focused right now on third-party finance, given those barriers. A second opportunity or learning lesson and huge opportunity is battery storage. Not only is challenging to get permitted and zoned in New York City, that gets talked about a lot. What gets talked about a lot less is that battery storage economics really incentivize pumping the energy back into the grid for grid reliability purposes, which is very important, but it does not incentivize backup power or resiliency in the same way. And that's a major societal gap and could be a real lost opportunity, as we expect the same rapid curve in development for battery storage as what we've been seeing in solar, which now is getting over each of the last 3 years. Even last year, we've seen more than 5,000 permits processed through the Department of Buildings for solar projects. So we're seeing a lot of solar. We can and will see more, but not just whether, but how battery storage is developed along with solar is a question that needs to be asked in a very clear way as to the outcomes that we're looking to achieve. So at that, I'll turn it back to you, Nancy. No.
Nancy,
thank you. You've really started us off with quite a menu of things that have been accomplished and where we must be going. Next, I'd like to turn the floor over to Sonal and her leadership of her organization, both on policy and on a very, very nitty-gritty community scale, both green energy and workforce development initiatives that are becoming nationally known. Sonal.
Thanks, Nancy, and thanks, Rob, for kicking us off. So just a little bit about WEACT for those of you that are not familiar. We are a community-based organization based in West Harlem in New York City. We have been organizing to build healthy communities since 1988, when our executive director, Peggy Shepard, and her co-founders were actively community organizing against some toxic facilities placed in West Harlem. And so now we work and organize in the catchment areas of Harlem, Washington Heights, and Inwood, but we do policy work on the citywide level, statewide level, and federal-wide level. So in my position as a director of policy, I oversee our city and our state policy initiatives. Climate justice is an important issue for WEACT. This is something that has come up for us a lot as something that our community members find central or necessary to address in order to be safe and healthy in their neighborhoods. So Hurricane Sandy in 2012 hit. People lost power in their homes. People lost their homes. People are dealing with a lot of health consequences of the hurricane overall. There's a lot of things we're talking about, but I'm focusing mostly on like the building and what that did. And what came out of that was that WEACT participated or led a Northern Manhattan planning process, which we basically brought in 400 plus members of the Northern Manhattan community and said, how can we prepare for climate change? This is obviously a major issue. This is impacting our community, which is lower income, and communities of color particularly. It is impacting you first and worst for so many different reasons, all tie back to historic racism and environmental racism. And what do we want to do about it? And one of the big things that community members said was they have concern about the lack of power they have in their energy, in their power. And so since then, we have been focusing on the idea of energy democracy. How do we make sure that people have ownership in their energy, that they have a say in where that energy comes from, and that what we now are focusing on is also the just transition, which is how do we make sure that Black and African-American people and Latinx people that we represent and work with are heavily represented and have a centralized stake in our transition away from this extractive fossil fuel economy to a renewable regenerative economy. So we have therefore started working and done a lot of work in solar and solar worker training since. We have trained over 100 people from New York City, mostly from Northern Manhattan. We have a couple of people from the Bronx, a couple of people from Brooklyn, but mostly Northern Manhattan people in solar installation, gotten their certificates for construction so that they can be a part of this workforce. What we found, and we've done a couple kind of internal audits and working with those trainees, what we found is what is not surprising, which is that they face a lot of barriers to getting jobs in solar. And a lot of that is due to what we tie back to a lot of racist policies or programs or just structures that make it hard for people of color to be employed. For example, a lot of our solar workers have a criminal background, and they firmly believe that that was a barrier to them getting employed, even though that's actually illegal. So there's a lot of reasons why solar workers were having trouble with employment in the solar industry. And what they did in response, which is so amazing, is that they actually created their own solar business. They stopped, they decided we want to rely on ourselves to build out this, our stake in the solar world. And so what they put together was called, which is now called SUNS, it's a Solar Uptown Now Services. And it's a cooperative, a worker cooperative of about 15 or so workers, many that were trained through WEACT program to install solar across really the state. I mean, they've done work outside of the city as well as in the city. And so this is something that we are really excited about, and we want to continue to pursue this pathway of how do we not only make sure that people of color are in this new emerging industry, I guess, but also how do we make sure that it's owned by them, that they have a really big stake in that process. And then aside from that, the other solar work that we've been doing is just basically installing solar. So we have participated in Solar Uptown Now, which is a program working with a couple of other partners, such as Solar One, where we are installing solar panels across different buildings in Northern Manhattan, particularly HDFC buildings. So we've installed, I believe, 415 megawatts of solar power so far, and that is still growing. And we're also involved in a community solar project where we're putting solar on 3 different NYCHA buildings. And when that is completed, that will give us 1.2 megawatts of, 415 kilowatts is Solar Uptown Now. And we are, with the community solar, we'll be getting 1.2 megawatts of power from those buildings. And community solar is really important to us because it is really allowing people to invest in solar when they can't put solar on their own building, or it's too expensive, or whatever other barriers they might be. And so it's something that we really believe in as a great source of creating solar and allowing people that may not have enough money to buy their own solar panels to invest in solar and be a part of this new market. I keep saying new, but I know it's been around, but it's a growing market, I'll put it that way. So I will stop there and hand it over to Amy. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Sonal. Nancy, did you want to jump in for a second? Nope, okay. Great. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here, and thanks to Rob and Sonal for your remarks. We have heard a lot from Sonal and Rob at this point about the what and why of solar power in New York City, and so I'll dive into some of the legal hurdles and opportunities associated with scaling up renewable energy in New York City. In my work at the Sabin Center, I follow the legal frameworks that cities work within to advance climate-related goals, including the uptake of renewable energy. I follow this nationwide, but hopefully there are some lessons to be drawn at the New York City level, because I think that New York City is one of many that could do this much better. So when we break out the conversation about barriers to scaling up solar, I think it's helpful to distinguish between the utility scale and the distributed scale of solar energy resources, because they really face different legal barriers. So, distributed renewable energy, of course, includes rooftop solar panels, but also other smaller scale renewable energy projects like battery storage, microgrid, other district scale technologies. So all of these technologies really face permitting and regulatory barriers. One of the major gating items for distributed scale renewables, particularly on private property, are the cumbersome permitting and regulatory requirements that many of these projects are subject to. New York City has taken a first step by requiring, pursuant to the Climate Mobilization Act, that new buildings and major renovations of rooftops include either solar panels or green roof space. So that's a start, but there are still a lot of regulatory barriers to getting these projects permitted. So the city could do much more to streamline the permitting process to make sure that DOB and other agencies, their staff are really prepared to help applicants bring these projects online. Some approaches that have worked in other jurisdictions are to waive permitting fees for solar or renewable projects, to allow permitting applications for solar projects to cut to the head of the line, so to speak, for their review. Some places have created a quote uniform solar permit that essentially permits all rooftop solar development in the city in one go, and so new projects can sort of rely on that uniform or jurisdiction-wide permit. Some other legal tools include property tax abatements. We could certainly expand those types of financial tools to allow private property owners to expand the uptake of solar panels and other distributed scale technologies. One thing that I think is important to note is when we're talking about a city just expanding distributed solar generation, a lot of these really pesky legal barriers don't apply when the city is talking about undertaking a project on its own property. So New York City owns and controls a vast amount of property, and it really could do a much better job of expanding solar energy on these property. It's not just municipal office buildings as it is in some smaller cities that, there might only be a handful of buildings. New York City has so much building space, but also schools, museums, public works facilities, pavilions at parks, parking lots, et cetera. And so I think New York is really uniquely situated among cities in the US in terms of space that it controls, and it could put solar panels kind of on a good amount of this space, which would help move the market, make sure that we had more solar installers able to service the private sector as well. And the city would certainly have the authority to, for example, take advantage or to hire this worker cooperative type model that Sonal is exploring. There's really a lot that the city could do on its own property to advance not only solar policy but equitable climate policy. Rob mentioned battery storage and microgrid technologies. These are really complementary to distributed solar for the reasons that Rob spoke about. And the city could do far more to streamline the permitting processes for battery storage and other microgrid technologies as well. The utility scale barriers are a bit different. So much of the law governing the power sector is really at the state level. And so almost anything related to utility scale purchases of energy are going to need to abide by the state public service law. So this means that even though utilities like Con Ed and National Grid operate within the city, much of the authority over them comes under state law. The city has the ability to contract with utilities, to partner with them, but it's going to have a harder time sort of requiring utilities to act in certain ways. But there are definitely things that the city can do to help facilitate the utility scale renewable energy that will need to go fully greenhouse gas.
Amy, I'm just going to interrupt one moment. If someone in our audience has a pet dog who just wants to add to the discussion.
Yeah, it's mine. I'm so sorry.
Okay.
Sorry about that. Hopefully he'll quiet down in a minute. There are several things that the city could do and has done. One is sort of catalyzing the development of these offshore wind hubs. We're talking about wind power now, not solar, but the city has has some ability to push for the build out of these offshore wind manufacturing hubs along the waterfront, which could be a really great thing for local job creation and for sort of revitalizing EJ communities. Of course, the devil is very much in the details there, but there's a lot to be done there in terms of really providing the space for this for manufacturing of both solar panels and wind turbines and other things. Local Law 97, I think, did a good job in one sense of incentivizing local green power. Of course, building owners can purchase RECs for their buildings so long as the electricity is fed directly into Zone J, New York City's portion of the grid. But there's real danger there that the state could sort of step in and override that as they almost did during this legislative season. So even though New York City is able to develop these really novel laws focused at decreasing greenhouse gas emissions and increasing the uptake of renewable energy in New York City, there's still that state law piece that can really function as a barrier. Fortunately, we had a lot of really loud advocates who did a great job of spotting this and calling it out and really organizing around it and making sure that this effort to weaken local law 97 got shut down. But it's certainly a danger that the state law could come in. So that sort of brings me to my last point, which is that a lot of the city's authority over utility scale renewables really comes down to advocacy with the state and federal government. So I think, in a next mayor, we'll really want someone who can be an effective advocate with the state to make sure that we're getting our fair share of this offshore wind, to make sure that we're getting, clean renewable power and can use that power in order to shut down these dirty peaker plants that still, run in New York City and in particular in EJ communities. This is something that the city has some peripheral control over, but not direct control. And so, advocacy with the state will be really important. I also just quickly wanted to highlight the work of some of my Sabin Center colleagues. We have an initiative called the Renewable Energy Legal Defense Initiative, or RELD for short. And that initiative provides legal representation to community groups who are in favor of renewable energy projects that are encountering opposition. They've yet to take on a project in New York City, but they're very much open to doing so. So if you think this might be a fit, I encourage you to check it out. It's the Renewable Energy Legal Defense Initiative at the Sabin Center.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Sonal. Thank you, Rob. This is certainly a rich discussion, rich presentation, and one that I think makes me, and I think should have generate a lot of energy, no pun intended, and excitement amongst our participants today. I'd like to lead off this segment of our discussion by noting that it's now just 2 months, I think under 2 months, until the New York City primary elections. And given the way New York City voters tend to vote, the Democratic victors in the primaries are certainly the people we're going to be seeing run for office in November, and many of them who win the primaries this June will be the people in office this November. This is a big year, as I'm sure you all know, for New York City elections. The mayor, the controller, the public advocate, the 5 borough presidents, and some number, although I don't have it at my fingertips, of city council. There'll be new city council seats, and in some cases, because the seats are open, in at least one case, because the current holder of a city council seat was forced to just resign because of not paying his taxes. But there'll be also a number of existing candidates or existing placeholders who'll be running in a new kind of election, which the outcomes of which, with ranked choice voting, may lead to some surprises. But we have right now as I think we all see it, a 2-month time frame where, as Rob said, and you've all noted one way or another, that climate and clean energy issues has finally, after years of languishing below the fold, climate, clean energy issues are above the fold for everyone. And part of our hope today and part of our intention is to speak to some of the top recommendations or ideas our speakers have for what will ultimately be the incoming New York City administration. So I would ask each of you, Rob and Sonal and Amy, to engage in kind of an Einsteinian thought experiment. You get an email, you get a phone call, you get a text from the incoming, or the incoming mayor, incoming city council people, et cetera, saying, I'd like to meet with you and get your top ideas for what we can do, what the new administration can do to really make New York a climate leading, carbon cutting, solar friendly, and environmentally just city. What we can do to either build on what we have, expedite, cut our way through red tape. What can the incoming administration do? And your question is structured in 2 parts. What can the incoming administration do that you would see as top of the list in their first 100 days and in their first year in office. And let's take it, Rob, Sonal, and Amy, and then each of you jump in as the conversation rolls out. So starting with Rob.
Thank you, Nancy. Well, in my eyes, we're beyond any single policy or initiative, and it's time to step back and develop the resilient power plan of 2022. This needs to be a comprehensive plan, a citywide plan. This is a plan that can be led by the mayor. This is also legislation that could be advanced by the city council to have a public process across the city that looks procedurally for building and zoning code, fire department, and so forth. We're looking at technologically at solar and storage, siting issues, financially, how do we leverage city, state, and federal dollars? And in terms of workforce development and job creation, we need an integrated approach that looks at more than just one building code, one financial incentive at a time to consider the outcomes that we need to achieve. And I look at 3 different timelines. Well, first is that this comprehensive plan should be completed in the first year. So by December 31st, 2022, that this plan should be completed, announced probably the beginning of 2023. Then within the following 12 months, we need resiliency plans in every single community board across New York City. And by the following 12 months, by the end of 2024, then we need a baker's dozen, a dozen and one backup, resiliency projects under development in every community board, so that by the time the following elections are in place, that we have 767 projects under development across New York City, and these are focused in the neighborhoods and the communities that need them the most.
Thank you. Sonal.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that there's probably 100 things I would request in 100 days. There's a lot, but I'll focus on a couple. Just simply, we need to be working faster to create energy efficient buildings, and it's just not happening at this point. Putting solar and creating buildings that are all electric is great, but there are so many buildings in New York City that are old and are really clunky and are not working to their efficient level. And that is not only impacting the amount of energy that the city uses overall, but it's leading to really high utility bills, for example, for lower income people, which is a major concern of ours at WEACT. So I would say one of the top things I would ask for is to really rev up and become aggressive with a program around making buildings energy efficient. That there are some really low cost things that can be done, but there are also some, funding that can be provided by the city. For example, by way of Local Law 97, any profits that come from that should go directly to providing lower income building owners, lower income homeowners with money to make their buildings more energy efficient. That should be a no-brainer. And that also includes NYCHA, it includes public housing in that, needing funding for this process. So that is one of the top things that I would ask for. Also, there's a current sort of petition and advocacy efforts going on by a lot of solar installers and people just in the solar world in New York City to petition to the Public Service Commission to increase the community credit cap that exists. And so the city being involved in that advocacy would, make a big difference. I'm not sure if they are already, but I know that their work to increase that would be really vital to allowing more community solar in New York City. I'd also add sort of what Amy was saying about the city owning a ton of buildings. Those should just be solar next year. I don't know what is taking so long. So that's another thing that I would put in there on the top list, but there's so many more, but those are just some of them.
Well, the next mayor and the administration will certainly be getting an earful they need to hear. So let's turn this now over to Amy, and then we will try to find a way of bundling together a number of the really terrific questions we're starting to get from our audience. So, Amy.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, first of all, I would absolutely echo what Sonal is saying about making our buildings more energy efficient. I mean, these renewable energy and energy efficiency and building electrification are not, three individual things in a vacuum. They really, really function together. I'm so sorry about my dog. So I would really just echo that. In terms of, what the new mayor or new city administration could do in the first little bit of time. I mean, taking down some of these regulatory barriers, I think right from the start, it could be really impactful. Just sort of taking a look at what a property owner has to go through in order to put solar panels on their roofs, and just streamlining it, I think would be hugely helpful. Certainly would not get at the whole problem of not being able to uptake solar, and certainly would not get at a lot of the equity issues, but could really kind of just cut through some of that red tape right away. I think another big piece of this is utility scale solar or wind purchases of power. We need both, right? We need distributed resources and we need utility scale resources. And so really just finding a way, there's certainly technical assistance available to help, figure out how do we enter into a large scale procurement of renewable energy, and not just for city buildings, but really community wide. The other thing I would really highlight is that the new administration has really got to work with community to figure out what our solar program should look like, what any laws relating to our solar program should look like. Local Law 97, I think, is a good example of really bringing a lot of stakeholders together, and that law is better because community members are involved and informed what it looked like, and informed, what some of the second and third order consequences of various provisions of that law are. So I think it's just extremely important as this is all sort of playing out in real time. We've got to have stakeholders at the table. We've got to have community members at the table. We've got to have, EJ groups at the table. I just think that these laws and other solar related requirements are going to be stronger for having considered the input of community members from the start, rather than discovering, second and third order consequences later. And that's something that I hope the new mayor is acutely tuned into.
Thank you all. I'm now going to try to figure out a way. We have many really in-depth questions coming in from our audience members. I guess the usual caveat: we have more great subjects and great questions than we could possibly have time to answer. So I'm going to try to take the moderator's prerogative of putting some themes around some of the questions. And I see a number, and if any of you speakers see a particular question that you really feel you must turn to and answer, just by all means do this. But a number of the questions that are coming in, I see revolve around the theme of, like, I'm going to call it cutting red tape, whether it is at the rooftop scale of the time, because time is also money. The longer it takes to actually get permits and approvals to put things up on rooftops, in a way that the more barriers that are created. Something similar, I think, would apply at the community scale. And then there are also questions about what can be done, what the city can do to facilitate the process of interconnectivity with the Con Ed grid, and back to Rob's question about battery storage. So for your hypothetical meeting with the incoming mayor, what would you see at the top, let's say top 2 or 3 things a mayor and or city council could do to facilitate the process of getting solar installed at the different scales, and what would you like to see an incoming administration do that you think could really make a difference quickly?
I love the idea that Amy put out there of consolidated permitting. It's these transaction costs. When you look at smaller buildings like multifamily housing, affordable housing, add up very quickly. They make it more difficult to finance projects. So I think Amy's done the research and knows how this could actually happen. I think that's a great idea that would help.
Anybody else want to take that one on? If not, I'm going to ask a couple of, pose a couple of particular questions that as insiders, we may know the answer to, but as anyone who doesn't live and breathe this 24/7 might find it puzzling. One of the questions that came in is, why does 80% of the power New York City uses have to be generated within city limits? This seems to be inequitable and should change. Upstate is losing population, and why can't we easily use power that's created anywhere in New York State? Amy, I think that might be a question for you. It sounds like a legal question.
I mean, it's more of just I totally agree. I think that's ridiculous for a whole bunch of reasons. It prevents us from scaling up renewable energy resources in the city the way we need, and it's also hugely inequitable and probably one of the major reasons why we still have these peaker plants, right? So I would heartily endorse that question, and I think it's sort of. I think that it sort of underscores the reliance that New York City right now is very much feeling on New York State, right? So New York State has this goal to completely green the electricity grid under the CLCPA, and New York City is sort of relying on the state to actually do that in order to reach its climate goals. And we don't really have for a whole bunch of complicated reasons that political reasons that I won't sort of take sides on. It's we don't have really effective advocacy in New York State right now, but we're very much relying on New York State to completely green not only the state's grid and our grid, and that's exactly the sort of barrier that needs to be gotten rid of.
My understanding of that issue is and I agree with Amy, but my understanding is that there's a technical limitation and the concern is reliability at the point when the grid would be most stressed, that because of transmission limitations, the physical ability to get electricity from outside of New York City, that we need to be able to generate 80% of our annual peak electricity as a city from within city limits to ensure that we don't lose power. I know that number's been around as long as I've been practicing, so the better part of 2 decades, and perhaps that could be reevaluated, but transmission is a very real limitation presently.
But again, we totally depend on the state to increase our transmission, right? Like the city has very little control over increasing transmission into the city. So it's this barrier that might be related to transmission, but we can't do anything on our own to increase that transmission.
A question, I don't know the answer to this, but has the city conducted a feasibility study for the potential for transmission, or identify the costs or potential locations for where transmission lines could come? I think it can be easier to shepherd resources when we know exactly what resources we need, and we certainly have a lot of capability to figure that out, even if we can't finance it or don't have permissions over site control entirely.
Another question has come in, which seems to me to be a natural segue to this part of our conversation. And that is looking forward again to a next administration. What kind of city government reorganization would you see as being most impactful and most effective in helping New York City to actually tackle a lot of the hard questions and achieve many of the efficiencies and economic and human health and scaling goals that we've talked about here. And I'm going to turn that large question into a very specific one, and that is, do each of you, Rob and Sonal and Amy, would you recommend to an incoming mayor that she or he create an energy czar, someone at the, let's say, deputy mayor level, whose responsibilities will be the execution and scaling up and cutting of red tape for a wide array of renewable energy issues, and obviously, given our focus today, renewable energy issues? Does someone have to have that job, and does that solar buck have to stop on someone's particular desk?
I mean, Nancy, I would just sort of maybe take issue with the terminology. I don't think this is just about energy, right? It's about climate. It's about climate justice. It's about energy justice. And so I think we need to make sure that, I think it would be great to have sort of someone in charge of a whole of government approach to climate change. But I think we need to be very mindful of what that person is responsible for, because I would hope that they would not be responsible only for scaling up energy, right? Like, there are many other related pieces of this, including the community, including climate related goals, including just transition. And I think that person would need to be able to see that entire space.
Very well taken and well put. Sonal, Rob?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that I agree with kind of what Amy's saying, is that we can't take too siloed of an approach to addressing our climate crisis. And the just transition principle includes a lot of principles that aren't just technical, but they're very much rooted in societal shifts. And that moves way beyond just energy, but it moves into housing, it moves into financial security, it moves into sort of our waste cycles. It moves into so much stuff. And the mayor does have people that kind of do that. We had Dan Zarelli, who's now not here, and we've got a new person that has come in. We have a lot of people in the mayor's office of resiliency, of sustainability, of climate and policy, that all are dedicated to this work. I would say, this is something that we've been advocating for, is that those offices should be permanent. They shouldn't just be mayoral appointed offices, and that will help with that process. I mean, but additionally, something that would be great to have is people that are really dedicated to tracking how this process is going and are sort of independent of the mayor, so that we can actually be conducting more potentially objective reports on how this work is going, with respect to transitioning to energy, with respect to building efficiency, with respect to who's getting impacted the most, all of these questions. I think that's important. But yeah, I would say there are people that are doing this work who are really, doing great work. But yeah, making it permanent would be a good step forward.
Rob, do you have anything to weigh in on that? Given your experience and the sausage making of legislation.
Well, I go back to whoever has the money makes the rules, right? And I think one of the challenges, when you look at water policy, then you go to DEP, right? For better or worse, right? DEP has tremendous capacity. They lose, and they can fund and they can do what they want to do. And I wonder if there's an opportunity for a more boutique and nimble special purpose entity that's really able to focus on energy policy and planning and raising the funds, but is where community planning and equity are baked into it at the front, but you also have the ability, is it an authority structure? Is it a nonprofit, quasi-governmental entity? But I think we're at the point where, with energy, we need to look at the mayor's office, and that needs to continue. But it's some sort of centralized approach could help to leverage resources and streamline a lot of the efforts that are in place right now. So I think that's a question worth considering.
A related citywide question, and no one has asked this, but since I spent many years in the New York City Controller's office, I have to ask it, and that is the New York City Controller has very significant powers and large staffs to do audits of city agencies. Have you heard any of the current candidates for running for City Controller's office speaking about how they would use the powers of their office to maximize and improve the delivery of the wide range of services and policies that we've been discussing here and that Amy so eloquently laid out? And I'm certainly not asking here for anybody's advocacy or endorsement of a particular candidate, not at all. But given the powers of this citywide office, is there something you'd like to see the next incoming city controller do?
So one really interesting idea that we've seen it internationally in Oslo, but that was introduced by former council member Constantinides a year or two ago is the idea of a citywide climate budget, and that can mean a whole bunch of different things. But what it really means is that every agency is meant to account for the emissions associated with what they're doing, kind of in the same way that they would be meant to account for the dollars associated with what they're doing. And so I think there are opportunities to really build in sort of an emissions accounting into every agency's work.
We don't have that at present. I should know the answer to that, but to think that we don't, at least to me, is a surprise. And I'm going to just put Sonal and Rob on the spot for a moment and wondering if you think that would be if Amy's idea would be something that you would really strongly support the next administration to be doing.
Sonal, you can take that.
I guess I would need more time to think about it, to be honest. But it sounds good at this point.
We're almost out of time, but there's one interesting question I would love to pick up before we take off, if we can squeeze it in, Nancy.
Please do.
Bomi asked an interesting question. Hi, Bomi. Glad you could join us. If there are any models for government entities serving as off-takers to community solar projects, especially those with community goals such as workforce hiring and so forth. And there are actually, I think existing community solar policy is able to address some of this. When community solar is built on a project, then up to 40% of those credits can go to the building itself. Also, credits can go off-site for a project. So a couple examples, there's a project, actually a major housing authority. In addition to solar development, we broker community solar credits. And in New Jersey, we just signed up one of the largest public housing authorities to off-site community solar projects. And so that's a huge opportunity. It could be a public agency as well. We've subscribed schools, public schools, upstate New York to the same thing. So New York City is more constrained because of the amount of credits that are typically generated on a site. Credits usually go to the building first. So there are some practical questions about like limits of getting large buildings to subscribe to these projects. But perhaps we could adapt something for larger scale projects like wind projects, for example, that would be more in line with the volume of energy that's used by a city agency.
Yeah, so I mean, there are a number of examples. This is very much an emerging area, and it really depends on the state law applicable to the specific city. So I'll say up front that I don't know the answers offhand for New York City, but certainly there are examples of cities figuring out different ways to enter into power purchase agreements, to enter into green tariffs. One county in Virginia has entered into a virtual power purchase agreement. So this is something that's very much emerging. There's an organization or an initiative called the City Renewables Accelerator. It's through WRI and some other organizations, the Climate Challenge, where they are sort of providing technical assistance to cities to figure out what form of utility scale procurement might work for them. And then they also have a tracker, which I posted in the chat, that follows what some of these transactions have been. So it's a super interesting question, and it would involve kind of like a deep dive into the applicable state and local law here in New York City, which I would love to talk more with you about, Bomi. But there are definitely examples. It's just a matter of like making the examples kind of more, I guess, tailoring what we could do specifically in New York City to legal and other constraints of the type that Rob talks about.
Given the questions that have come in and our time constraints, let me ask as a last question to each of you whether there are one or two particular participant questions that have come in that you'd like to tackle in our last few minutes on air.
Yeah, someone asked about an example. Sorry, I now have a dog and a toddler in the background. I'm really sorry. Someone asked about a specific example of a RELD representation. So an example, I mean, they've done several of these, but an example is the wind transmission project that we've all read about in East Hampton, in New York, that, kind of this very wealthy enclave on the east side of Long Island. Is, there are folks there that are opposed to having a transmission cable from an offshore wind project come onto their, not onto their beach, under their beach. Sorry, I'll cut the editorializing, but so there are also groups that are very much in favor of having that transmission cable because it's good for all of us, right? It brings clean renewable energy into the community and into the state. And so our lawyers have represented those community groups that are in favor of the transmission project. They have, appeared at PSC proceedings, both submitting letters and also testifying on their behalf. As another example, there are several wind projects around the country where, someone wants to install a wind project on their property, and there are, either zoning constraints or community opposition. And so our lawyers represent them in the relevant, perhaps local land use proceedings or the PSC proceedings, or whatever may be applicable in that case.
Sonal or Rob, last words of wisdom. Okay, on that, with apologies to the many questions that have come in that I'm afraid we really haven't had the time to touch on today. I want to thank Rob and Sonal and Amy and say that so much has been raised today and the stakes are so high. And when it comes to saving our planet, the time each day is getting shorter. Therefore, the urgency of action, the urgency of doing it right, doing it fairly, doing it effectively, getting it done, getting it to scale. I would like to say I hope to see each of you and reconvene this panel late April at 100 days of the next New York City administration. And we'll see who's in office, where we have come, and where we need to be going. So thank you all, and until next April 29th. Thank you, everyone.